I want to thank our sponsor tonight, Hamilton Brooks Smith Reynolds. I believe they were one of our earliest sponsors. I think they've been a sponsor for over 25 years, maybe even 30 years. So thank you very much for your sponsorship. We exist primarily on annual sponsors, program revenue, and memberships. And so their support over the years really makes a huge difference. And with that, I'm going to introduce our moderator for tonight, Khalid.
Thank you. Tonight is special for a number of reasons in my mind. In 2015, when I first got involved in esports, something like this would have had like these two guys here, and that's it. That'd have been just about it. But now it's a buzzword, but also it's a real business. And so we're going to be here, myself and the four panelists that come from a broad range of the esports ecosystem, from in the trenches as a general manager to looking at it from legal and technological aspects, academic, and what's going on in the college scene. So I'm very excited. My background is one as an investor and an owner of the esports team, and dragged into it. So I've been able to see it from really all angles. So we're going to go through, address a number of issues related to esports and the blockchain and the collegiate scene and technology, and then hopefully leave an ample amount of time to answer questions, which are more interesting to me than anything else. So tonight's titled Esports, Gaming, and Blockchain Technology Revolution, and it truly has been that. It has truly been revolutionary when you see the distance that it's come, not only in terms of the business, but in terms of just acceptance, and to have the kind of sign-off that people have given the esports landscape in the last, really, for me, 3 years, but even longer than that, as some people have been around. And so I want to show a small video and go through a couple of slides as a primer. Just really quickly, just a show of hands, anyone who's been to an esports event. And then another show of hands of people who would say, I really don't know anything about esports whatsoever, but I'm here and I'm interested. Okay, so that's what we thought. That's the both ends of the spectrum. People have been to an event because you've got knowledge, you know something, you have interest, and then people don't know anything. So we're going to do a bit of a primer. So for the people who raise their hands first, you're the board. The people who raise their hands second, we're going to bring you into the conversation really quickly. So first the video, then some slides.
Have you guys seen esports and the E-League?
I don't know if that's sports.
But
It's crazy mind savvy.
But I don't know if athlete is the right word that I would go for. You don't break a sweat. I don't consider it a sport.
No, you do.
Watching people play video games isn't like watching people play football. It's like watching people play fantasy football. It is one more step removed from human activity. You understand?
It's video games. It shouldn't be on a sports network. It's video games.
But can it truly be a spectator sport? It already is. 71 million watched it last year. They reckon it's going to, by 2017, it'll be 145 million people watching it.
They're actually giving college scholarships for video gaming. And it's even gone to the point that now the government has acknowledged professional video gamers as athletes.
Same way you watch a football match, you can hear the crowd, everyone's cheering the team on, you make friends, there's people you talk to, you play with online. It's all about community, it's being part of something that you're incredibly passionate about.
He lives! Ambition! Saves the game! What the
So that video is specifically about the game of League of Legends, which is to this day the most popular esport. And the reason why I like to show that video, especially to people who don't know much about esports, is so that you can intrinsically understand the passion that goes behind it, to intrinsically understand that this is not fringe, this is not like some kid with like Cheetos stains on his shirt drinking Mountain Dew like in his basement. Like it's not that, and it's been not that for a while. And with that, I'd like to introduce all the panelists, starting immediately to my left is Jake Fife. He is the general manager of Echo Fox, which means he technically works for me, so he's on the dime right now. Thanks, Jake. And Jake also has the distinction of being the very first Echo Fox employee. Next is TL, who's over there, professor of comparative media studies at MIT and co-founder and director of research for AnyKey, and also happens to be one of the foremost leading minds on live streaming and its implications sort of in-game and beyond gaming. To her left is Kevin Mitchell, Director of Business Development at National Amusements, Inc., an adjunct professor of esports at Emerson College, and I have to imagine one of the first people in the nation with such an appellation, and someone who I've turned to and will continue to turn to for issues regarding the growth of collegiate esports. And back towards the middle here, Giovanna, I always mispronounce your last name, Giovanna. Fessenden. I didn't mispronounce it because I asked just now. Of counsel at Hamilton Brooks Smith Reynolds, tonight's sponsor, and someone who I have numerous times leaned on for all things related to blockchain, and I now can actually explain it to a level of proficiency to like an 8th grader. So I feel like I've done well. And so with that, we'll start a little bit of the primer. I call it You Had Me at Esports, a digital audience, because I feel like that's what it is. When you hear it, when you see it in the very beginning, when you see the stadium, you're hooked immediately. The question people ask a lot of, what are esports? Like, what is it? It's gaming and esports are different. Gaming has everything to do with playing the game. Esports is specifically referred to as the competitive aspects of it. Some of those lines are now being blurred, which we'll talk about. And the one thing that's really important to me is that it's not a monolith. We talk about esports as if it's one thing like sports, but each of the different titles and each of the different genres in esports carry its own constituency, carry its own laws, and carry its own its rules and ways of behaving, whether that be League of Legends on one end that generally tend to be younger kids who are more proficient, all the way to some of the sports games like Madden, which have a very different fan base. So that's very important to keep in mind. Major stakeholders in esports, this is really very, very important, and if you don't get anything out of any of the other slides, please get something out of this. In esports, the major stakeholders start with the game publishers. They make the games. So all the games that anyone plays in esports starts with the publisher who makes and markets and sells a game. Then you get to organizations that are the teams. They organize the teams that play in the games that the publishers make. League and tournament organizers like ESL or MGE do just that. They organize tournaments around the games that the publishers make. And then at the end, stakeholders are broadcast and distribution outlets. No different than traditional sports, who you have the NBCs or the ESPNs who broadcast the games. We've got the Twitches, Facebook, YouTubes, and on terrestrial television, you even see ESPN and Turner Sports broadcasting esports games. Esports is also very, very popular. People know this. I like to quantify it sometimes. These are numbers, viewership numbers for various traditional sports as compared to esports. There's really only 2 sporting events in the world that outstrip viewership for the League of Legends World Championships. One here is the Super Bowl, the other is the World Cup. Other than that, you see here, this is the NBA Finals Game 4, the World Series Game 5, and NHL Stanley Cup Finals Game 5. And if you add all of those up, these are all the clinching games for each one of those. You add all of those up, and you don't get to the level of viewership for League of Legends World Championships alone. Esports is massive and it's global. Esports is something that was born globally and now it's become more local, but whereas traditional sports is born locally and has been trying to become more global. So it's a built-in advantage. Really quickly on esports versus traditional sports, that's a big question that people ask a lot. What are the differences? The first one is IP ownership, which we touched on a little bit. In esports, a publisher, a Riot Games, an EA, owns the actual game that is being played. In traditional sports, the NBA is the most dominant basketball league, but they do not own the thing called basketball. All of us can get together in this room and go to the pitch competition next week and pitch ourselves a new basketball league, and if we get the funding, we can do it. No one's going to come and stop us and run to the USPTO and say we can't do it. In esports, that's certainly not the case. League structure, because of the ownership at the IP level, in traditional sports, let's take the NFL, for example. There's 32 teams that make up the NFL, and those team owners together are the thing we call the NFL. In esports, that's not the case. The teams are basically negotiating with the publishers who own the leagues or the league organizers who own the leagues for their various rights, how they get paid, how they participate, which is different from traditional sports where the teams own the actual leagues. Some of that is looking to change in esports as well. And thirdly, the third major difference is the team organization structure. In esports, generally speaking, with some exceptions like the game of Overwatch, one organization such as Echo Fox can participate in a lot of different esports under that brand. Think about it like the Olympics. The United States goes and competes in the Olympics, and we compete with our different athletes in all the different sports. Whereas in traditional sports, even if you owned a baseball team, a basketball team, a football team, and a hockey team, they would have to be branded separately. So that's a pretty significant difference. People ask about salaries a lot. What do these kids make? And they're appalled. For League of Legends, at least, that's not a League of Legends player, but it's a cool picture of Ninja. But in League of Legends, the minimum salary is $75,000, but top players can make over $1 million a year. And salaries have risen very rapidly. So even the salaries are starting to challenge it. The highest paid League of Legends player makes more than the lowest paid NFL player. And that's something that only happened in the recent vintage. People say, okay, that's nice, it's popular, everyone's watching it, and kids are making a lot of money, but how do the teams actually make money? And so I've listed the major revenue sources for teams. These are not all of them, but these are the major ones. You have sponsorships, which is no different than you see a Coke ad. Teams will get sponsored by Snickers or Coke or Pepsi or whatever. And they're split in esports between what are called endemic, which means things that are related to gaming, headphones, keyboards, computers, and non-endemic, the things that we would think of with sponsorship in general when we look at ads from the big, large brands. League revenue sharing, even though the publishers own the leagues, in recent years, franchising has come, and when franchising has come, which means that you can share some of the revenue with the publisher, so that's been increasing. Merchandise sales, just like traditional sports, we want to sell jerseys, hats, t-shirts, etc. Produce content. Esports teams have to proselytize. They have to get their word out, and they do that by producing content around their players and pushing that to YouTube and to Twitch. And those organizations sign deals with esports teams to provide content, not unlike a network would pay a producer money to put their television show on their network. And lastly, streaming, and this dovetails a little bit with produced content, but streaming platforms like Twitch allow teams to go directly to viewers and monetize that through ad sales and other ways. And we won't go too deep in streaming on Twitch because we have the streaming experts here, but the one thing I will say, if people are familiar, if they've heard it a little bit, is that streaming on Twitch allows mostly young kids, and mostly due to gaming, to go online and watch other people play video games. And most people's response is, that's ridiculous. And secondly, when I tell them, but wait, they actually donate money to the people who they're watching play video games. And then they say on top of that, well, that's even more ridiculous. And so I say to them, there's something from my childhood that I remember, and probably you all know as well, where people got on TV and asked for money so that they continue to have programming. And that thing is PBS, if you remember those telethons. Right? So the idea that what the kids are somehow doing today is ridiculous or far-fetched really has analogs in the terrestrial world. And the more that you all can keep in mind the analogs to the world that you know will help you understand the world that you don't in esports. So some of the topics that we'll get into tonight include cryptocurrency and blockchain, the growth of the college scene, streaming beyond games, diversity, and we may touch on gambling and gaming from a sportsbook perspective, which is very, very hot. We may not get through all of it, but we're going to get through a lot of it. So with that, I will ask the very first question, and this goes to you, Joanna. Esports, as we just got finished talking about, people don't know a lot about it in general, and then also your particular field in blockchain, people don't understand that so much as well, but those are two really emerging and growth industries that are now converging. Can you talk about the interplay between them and where you see those two moving together in lockstep going forward?
Great, yeah, thank you, Khalid. So I'm a patent attorney. My background is in computer science. And as a patent attorney, we really look at like the problem that technology is trying to solve and then what the technical solution is. And with blockchain in particular, blockchain solves a lot of problems that have plagued the gaming and esports industry, like the monetization problem, for example, and also providing security to transactions. So the blockchain itself is it's old technology. It's a combination of old technologies like a shared ledger that's in a distributed network, and we're using consensus technology to write transactions to this ledger, which forms the blockchain. So the fusion of these old technologies together makes a really innovative solution that helps the gaming industry and the esports industry create secure transactions, like a cryptocurrency wallet, for example, can be implemented to enable in-game purchases, and you can have title to those purchases, and it can be stored on the blockchain and be recorded, and you can potentially trade those electronic assets, those skins, and license them to others. And one of the things about the blockchain, like for example, the platform like Ethereum has enabled smart contracts that can be tokenized on the blockchain. And smart contracts are just like little programs that are associated with the token, and they can have rules as to how they get distributed, how the token gets distributed. So with Ethereum, for example, you can create these. There's different types of tokens, and one of them, for example, is a non-fungible token. And I know a non-fungible token means it's like dynamic in terms of its value. And I just heard that even Amazon's Twitch service just a couple of days ago said that they're going to start accepting non-fungible tokens that can be given to players that are on Twitch to donate to in order for users on there that you like. And so it's just a way of monetizing this whole industry, providing a structure that can provide for secure transactions, and also provide for a structure in terms of tokenization, like Ethereum, the blockchain system. And it also works well when we were talking about how to monetize gaming, like when you have League of Legends, for example, or Fortnite, where they make most of their money through in-game purchases. And a blockchain structure can help keep track of those electronic assets and associate them with the user. And it just enables a lot of technological solutions that solve a lot of the problems that have plagued the gaming and esports industry, as well as like when the tournaments for distributing prize money and things like that can be done on the blockchain and provide that kind of structure, a trusted structure that can enable those transactions.
And TL, do you think that this has the impact to change the way that streaming occurs itself, or what impact on the streaming landscape do you think that will have?
I mean, the blockchain stuff I don't know, because it's interesting because we're talking about two co-emergent phenomena at the same time. I mean, there's a pretty robust system of economics and monetization already at work in the space. Like, I'd have to learn more about blockchain to understand that.
Well, can you talk a little bit? So can you talk a little bit about that? The monetization.
Yeah, exactly. So I was going to say, so
Awesome.
one of the things that's really important to understand about live streaming is the community itself has done a lot to innovate ways to compensate streamers. So of course, streamers, if they reach a certain level, are often getting ad revenue cuts with a platform like Twitch. But historically, what people did is they set up donation systems through third parties to give people money, as you were referring to. And I think connecting it back to NPR to PBS is a fantastic one. We have those models of patronage and donation. It happens all the time too. If you think of the ways musicians, their fans now will buy little bits to support them, like maybe you buy a t-shirt at a conference. So we've seen all of that also develop around live streamers. And that donation system, which was operating on third-party platforms, has now been picked up by Twitch because, of course, platforms see all of this economic activity happening outside of its walls and say, how can we get a cut? So Twitch now has a system of bits where you buy these little bits of currency and you use them and you kind of, you support streamers you like. So there's a pretty interesting set of economic structures that happen around live streaming. The one thing I will say, and I love being on this panel with two folks from Echo Fox, because from my perspective, it's all very up in the air. Nobody is actually sure how money is going to get made in this space. There's lots of experiments happening. And this is certainly the case with live streaming. I mean, there's ad revenue, but we also know that people use ad block software regularly, which undermines the abilities for ads to get through. So lots of innovation, lots of user-generated innovation, but a lot of, I would say, experiments that we don't quite know yet how they're going to pan out.
Jake, as someone who early in your esports career actually made somewhat of a living based on monetizing through live streaming and Twitch in the early days, can you talk a little bit about how the strategies have changed from the earlier days to today and where you see it going a little bit into the future?
Yeah, back in the early days, back in 2012, there weren't too many brand deals happening. There weren't too many people watching Twitch. It was still very emergent, still very new. Once the brands started coming in, like Nissan and Pepsi and Red Bull, it started spreading to the esports teams, and then it changed in a big way. A lot of the top streamers are these esports athletes, the top performing esports athletes. People want to watch them. I think people watch streaming for two things, for the most part. Entertainment and creativity, and then there's the athletes, and people are trying to emulate them and learn and improve, which is unique to gaming. So now, my athletes especially, they're interested in selling their own merchandise, selling jerseys, they get a cut, affiliate links too, they want to sell their brand products. The more Red Bulls they can sell, the more money they get, stuff like that. So figuring out ways and more creative ways to monetize. I mean, people are getting really creative with the third-party tools. There are Twitch bots now, which track who's watching, so you can identify the most engaging fans on your stream. People are doing Wheel of Fortunes to let fans have control over the stream and actually start engaging with influencers and DJs and influencers and celebrities are starting to understand that, and they're starting to live stream on Twitch too, because they see it as an opportunity to really connect with their fans where at a higher bandwidth that you can't get from like a Twitter or Instagram post. It's a very two-way street.
So Kevin, basically live streaming is in esports starting to blur the lines between professional and the sport and professional at gaming, whereas in traditional sports, you kind of need to be really good at the professional level to get this kind of monetization. In the same way, esports is dealing with a younger player base that becomes professionals at 17 and don't even necessarily have to go to the college scene at all. So as someone who is in the college scene and directing a lot of that in esports, where do you see esports college scene going, especially since a lot of the top gamers are 16, 17 years old and going straight to the professional ranks?
Well, I foresee colleges playing a very similar role to what you see in traditional sports. With athletes going through the NCAA type of structure, they're able to kind of mature and understand the processes and standards that are related to professional coaching, training, staying on schedules, media portions of their days, and trying to understand how it engages with sponsorships and the value chain as it relates to the premium talent being selected for a draft process. So looking at esports, at the stage that it's at now, colleges are the perfect training ground to begin to standardize processes that are very similar to the traditional sports industry, that allow for sponsors to be able to support consistency in events, to allow professional sports teams to be able to invest in talent, understanding that the talent that they're investing in has gone through structures and processes and situations that allow them to evaluate whether or not they're worth the monetization that they may provide them for a particular contract. So I think college is perfect from the standpoint of developing esports players with talent and maturity and professionalism, and also on the curriculum side to provide training for potential entrants into the esports side of the business. Media training, journalism, PR, data science, brand management, all these jobs have started to kind of evolve. Parallels that do exist in the traditional sports industry, but now they're starting to grow and be suitable for the esports industry.
Yeah, Kevin, you touched on the structure that is starting to mirror traditional sports and the move from college to the pros. One major difference is the involvement of the NCAA. At this point in time, can you talk about the current differences between the involvement of NCAA and traditional versus esports, and where you see the NCAA, I'll say, encroaching on the esports scene?
Well, it's non-pejoratively. Yes, it's a very interesting conversation taking place now on college campuses. One, because the NCAA, and I hope they don't take this out of context, is kind of looked upon as being the evil empire to esports players. And a lot of it's related to professional and amateur status and monetization. A lot of progressive millennials don't feel that it's fair that an athlete could generate, an enormous amount of revenue for a college and not be compensated for that. And the other challenge is related to prize pools. A lot of these participants are winning prize pools at 14, 15, 16, and that would potentially violate their status with the NCAA. So at this stage now, they've hired a company called Intersport to begin to do research and to understand what's the best pathway to enter the industry, because there's a lot of sensitivities that directly conflict with traditional standards. For example, there's an ongoing litigation regarding likeness, virtual rights related to EA Sports had a collegiate game that there were issues with using players' likeness and name. And one of the most recent exhibits was added due to a Big Ten network League of Legends competition. And there was an unjust enrichment kind of claim that was being filed. And it all was related to the disparity between traditional athletics and virtual athletics. And a lot of it hasn't been defined. That's one of the areas now that people are trying to decide, is it better for esports to be classified as an athletics program? Is it a student activity? Does it go under computer science? I'm one of the co-founders of an Ivy Esports League, and one of the challenges was trying to get all 8 schools to generally agree to one set of standards, rules, to allow students to be able to fund their trips to travel, to create uniforms, to use their name, to get sponsorships. So a lot of these issues are outstanding, and there's been another group called NACE, which is a National Association for College Esports, that's attempting to kind of serve as the NCAA for esports, but primarily there's a lot of junior colleges and D4 schools that are participating more for marketing purposes to recruit students. So it's all yet to be discovered and seen.
So amongst the rapid growth in esports, one thing that I don't think has been overlooked, but is certainly an elephant in the room, is that esports is overwhelmingly male. Overwhelmingly so. So Tio, can you talk a little bit about, while we're talking about college esports, Title IX issues, and then diversity in esports in general?
Yeah, so for those who don't know, Title IX was a really important piece of legislation that happened in, I think it was 1979. It really transformed women's participation in athletics. And basically, Title IX says if you take federal money, if you're an institution like MIT or many schools, if you take federal money, you have to ensure equity when it comes to all kinds of things, one of which is athletics. And women's participation in athletics shot up. I mean, we're talking massive tens of hundreds of thousands increase in percentage participation as a result of Title IX, because basically institutions like MIT and many others had to start paying attention to equity issues around participation. And so we've seen, I mean, I'm sure there's probably a handful of folks in here, myself included, who were born before 1979, but there was a time in which women were prevented from running in the Boston Marathon, for example. Hard to imagine now, probably for many of us. So this was really influential. And one of the most interesting things is in the kind of rush to esports hype and the creation of all these college programs, and I say this as a professor, not much attention is often paid to the fact that how does Title IX impact what we're building in collegiate esports? How do we start really paying attention to equity and ethics at the collegiate level? And part of what we'll, I'm sure, talk about is, there's the commercialization of esports that happens with all of the various economic models. But at least theoretically, colleges should perhaps also be a place where non-commercial models have space. And so how are we attending to diversity in our college campuses around esports? The bigger issue of diversity is, I think, a really important one. And to be frank, I would say esports is decades behind where traditional sports is. So right now, one thing we know is that men and women play computer games, period. It is a mainstream leisure activity. Many, many women play games. And in fact, the history of esports is also built on the work of women as well. Many people don't know the first collegiate Star League was founded by a woman. There are women working backstage in esports now, and they have been for years. So there's a presence of women in gaming now as gamers and historically in esports. Esports is making this mistake right now where they are misunderstanding the audience, and this goes to live streaming. So just for a little historical context, esports has been around for decades. I finished a book about esports in 2012, and honestly, that book ends, I don't know if this is going to be a niche phenomenon or, who knows what will happen. Live streaming changed everything because live streaming converts esports into a media space, and media space is about audiences. So the NFL, for example, knows now all of its audience growth comes from women. They have tapped out the traditional audience. Esports still misconceptualizes the audience as young, white men, and generally middle class. And until esports understands there's a whole bunch of gamers out there who don't fit that profile, who have money to spend, and perhaps, and I'm going to make a ethics claim, have a right to participate, it's going to miss the boat. So the diversity question is huge. It's not just about gender, but you can think too about how console and PC use is distributed differently amongst socioeconomic status, race and class. Those things also affect. So what games are getting played? Are they all PC games? Are we missing a massive audience of people interested in console games? But because we conceptualize esports narrowly, it falls off the map. So hugely important issue. As mentioned, I co-direct an organization called AnyKey, and we do both research and guidance and white papers to try to help esports realize, solve this problem now while you can. So you're not, 50 years from now going, oh my God, we've constructed an audience that we're not getting any leverage from anymore.
And we see that at the competitive level, especially the first year in 2015 when our team was involved in League of Legends play. I said, oh, are there any women or girls who play? And the response I got was, there's one non-male athlete, there was one trans League of Legends professional, and no non-males since then. And so my follow-up question to you, TL, is, because we're going to get to some solutions here tonight, too, is right, so there's an issue. We've identified that issue. Who can we hold responsible? In traditional sports, it's easy. There aren't enough black coaches in the NFL. That's the NFL's problem. There are not enough women who participate in the NBA and coaching ranks. That's the NBA's problem. Esports is a little more fractionalized. Is it the publishers? Is it organizations like us? Is it sponsors who pay the money and fuel all of this? What do you think the issue is?
It's and part of the work we do in AnyKey, it's a multi-nodal problem. So one thing that is really important to remember is that even though we have tons of women playing games, there's still systematic patterns of harassment and abuse that not just women, but people of color and queer folks often face online. So say you're an avid player, you put on the headset, you start using voice chat, and you get called out for being a woman. You get called out for what's often called, in my world, linguistic profiling. So these are the kinds of things that take people who are engaged, active, dedicated players and slowly winnow them out. And, you know, again, there's a beautiful and it's horrifying, like fantastic image of Catherine Switzer trying to run the Boston Marathon. And this amazing image of one of the guys who is managing the space kind of grabbing her to pull her out of the race. And this is exactly what we see in esports. So part of this is game developers not taking responsibility for their spaces to stop harassment when it's happening. Part of it are platforms that don't provide tools for community management. Part of it are organizations that field tournaments and don't have moderators in there to make sure the chat is non-harassing. Can you imagine if you went to Fenway and you had to sit around people constantly saying things to you because you were there? That would never happen. You could actually contact somebody and have them thrown out of Fenway. Why doesn't that happen more online? So, and it would be interesting to think about how teams can make a difference in this. What does it look like to cultivate new talent with an eye toward diversity and equitable future? So we all have a role.
And I think that's where colleges can play a role, just in terms of sensitivity and really starting at the ground level to kind of tackle those issues. You know, thinking about everything from fiscal responsibility, social responsibility, just awareness to gender diversity and issues related to that. I think colleges have a responsibility to take that by the helm.
Yeah. So this is definitely one of the stretch marks of esports, I'll say, as it grows, it's sort of leaving that vestige of the mark, but something that hopefully some balm and cream, we can fix that as well. Another stretch mark of esports, I think, is attendant to its growth, Giovanna, is what to do about this IP issue. We talked about it. Kevin mentioned the Ed O'Bannon case with respect to IP, but are there other legal issues in your mind as you see that esports really needs to keep its eye on as it continues to grow?
Well, one thing that I don't see a lot is protecting their IP. I mean, that's a huge component as part of an emerging technologies. You want to make sure that you protect your marketplace that you're creating, your online marketplace for trading skins and your assets, or for protecting your wallet, your wallets that you enable in your gaming technology. And there's just not a lot of effort in that direction in order to protect your technology. And I think that it's not necessarily, it's just a business decision that you should make, because you have to do it early. For patents, you need to file as soon as possible, and you want to make sure, like, you can file before you've actually implemented the invention. So if you have a technical solution, then you want to work with a patent attorney or work with an IP specialist and sketch out your idea and file your patent application, and you can use your patent application as your basis for your white paper. So this might be for a startup or something along those lines. If you have a particular technical solution in this space, you can use your patent application as to help protect your technology, and then you can start speaking with investors, get your white paper out there, tokenize your system, and start creating some kind of niche for yourself, and then you can make sure that you protect your assets. So that's one component. But also in terms of like your freedom to operate, you know, using players' likenesses, those are all, you know, very big issues, and you know, and a lot of those depend on what jurisdiction you're in, you know, and it's not all exactly clear, you know, how what IP out there is available to use and freely in your games or in your technology. Do you have thoughts?
I was just going to add, I was thinking about when you put up the stakeholders in the space. People might have noticed one of the stakeholders that we don't have, that we have in traditional sports, are player associations and unions, many of whom would be involved on the ground on contractual issues around rights of players, actually helping us get good information about the revenue leagues are actually earning. So this issue of kind of who are the stakeholders and who's going to be at the table negotiating that contract stuff is, I think, really interesting, and what's missing in that ecosystem right now.
And even in the tournament creation themselves, in terms of protecting IP, like, you know, the tournament server, the architecture for that system. I mean, there's a lot of innovation there, and there's not a lot of effort to, you know, really make sure that that is, you know, protected. And you know, we live in a country where it's a first to file situation with patents, and you want to file as early as possible. So it's whenever, you know, your team or, you know, your technologists come up with an idea, that you want to make sure that you protect that. That's an early step.
And this may be a question for you, Khalid. How does it work if a player has a lot of social media followers, okay, and then he gets signed by a professional pro team that wants to manage his social media rights? How does that work if he leaves the team, if you come in with a pre-existing following? How does that generally work?
Well, so I'll give you, I'll give a little bit of state secrets just now. Is the way it works is you lose all those social media followers, essentially, is the way that it works. But it's a serious issue, because this is once again one of the differences, and I'm going to have Jake speak to how we construct teams and how we go about looking at players and how to get into new esports competitions. But in a traditional sporting event or sporting meeting, from general management and ownership, you would not sit around and talk about whether or not we need to sign Kevin Durant because he's got 1.5 million Twitter followers, or however much he has. But that is an absolute front and center conversation in an esports organization, because it matters, and it's more than it matters on the margin. You know, talked about how esports teams make money. One of those ways is through content and how you monetize that content. So the fact that the eyeballs are going to come to you, uniquely come to you, it matters, especially all things being equal from a talent perspective. But certainly, even a scenario where maybe a kid is a little bit less talented, it matters. But from a contractual standpoint, teams generally, contracts were much more draconian 3 years ago than they are now. Players' rights have crept up and up and up, and I'd like to think that our organization was spearheading some of that change. But it used to be the case that when an esports athlete signed to an organization, they basically owned them lock, stock, and barrel with respect to how they can be exploited, their name, their likeness. They can make them do a certain number of hours of sponsorship. They can make them stream a certain amount of hours for themselves. So we actually contractually acquire their Twitter following, acquire their Facebook following, acquire their streamers, in which we pay back to them. And a lot of that is changing, even changing to where prior 3 years ago, if you signed an esports athlete, they couldn't go get their own deal. Right? Everyone had to do the same thing. Imagine everyone on the Warriors wearing the same shoe. That's basically what esports was. And we actually signed one of the first contracts that allowed a guy to go get his own sponsorships, and everyone else flipped out, because that was a significant right in a way that esports teams monetize. So in the future, those will become increasingly player-friendly, until where inevitably the march is going to be where it looks like players have the same rights in esports that traditional sports players have. But it will only come when the security of revenues comes in esports as well. Well, that was my question to me.
Yeah, no.
Also, I want to mention something too. I threw around the word skins, and Giovanna said a couple of times. Who is unfamiliar with what a skin is? When we say skinned, okay, everyone's on board. All right, right here. Okay, come through. All right. So, Jake, can you please quickly explain, because this very much has to do with the monetization of esports and goes into Giovanna's talk on crypto. Please explain what a skin is and go as deep as you want.
Sure. So I think simply put, skins are just cosmetics that can differentiate yourself to another person online. And that sounds a little bit crazy, but when you look at what people are wearing and why Yeezys are $1,000 in aftermarket, and so it's interesting. I think it's shaping the way games are developed too. You're moving towards this free-to-play model where there's no upfront cost to purchase the game. But Fortnite, for example, which is a free-to-play game, which is taking the Western Hemisphere by storm, it's free-to-play, but they've grossed well over $1 billion this year. And it's just because you can change the way your hair looks, or you look like a pumpkin. And so that's really interesting. With games like Counter-Strike, where it gets really interesting is you can start trading these skins. Fortnite and League of Legends don't have that. But in Counter-Strike, you can trade different gun skins and models. So there are sniper rifles that are worth well over $10,000, and it's the same sniper rifle in every functionality, damage, everything like that, but it looks cooler. And so it became problematic when people started gambling with these skins. So you could watch two teams compete. You can throw hundreds of dollars of skins in a pot. The platform takes a small percentage, and then if your team that you betted against or betted for won, then you would get your skins back plus more. And so a couple of problems happen with that. One, you can be trading skins when you're a minor, and you can be gambling on these platforms without any kind of age verification. The players that were competing were minors as well, some of them. Counter-Strike is a really interesting game where you could have a 16-year-old player on the same team as a 30-year-old player, but you can't gamble in games with minors. So that kind of goes into blockchain and how these platforms are trying to get into the space, walking on that fine line of what's legal, what's not, should we trade? So Valve as the publisher went in and said, hey, we are blocking all skin gambling websites. So they banned all of these avenues to gamble, but then more and more keep emerging. So now there's a roulette system where you can throw in your skins. You're not even gambling on a team anymore. It's a roulette. And so it's very interesting how fast these regulations are trying to keep up with how creative people are being with just the functionality of trading a cosmetic skin. You see it with ticket sales in real life and scalpers, and it's very similar, I think, the parallels.
And when I first got into esports, this very concept of skins was a seminal event for me, and hopefully for you all as you think about it, if you're thinking about it from an investment standpoint, if you're thinking about it from a monetization standpoint. Counter-Strike was the second game that we were involved in, and as we were putting our team together, Jake was explaining to me this concept of skins, and that there's a certain knife. At that point in time, we were talking about knives, and there was a knife in the game for which the skin, it just didn't make it stab any faster, any harder. The other team didn't bleed anymore because of the way this thing looked. But a certain way this one knife looked, it costs more. The digital good of that skin costs more than that exact same knife as if I went to the hunting goods store. And that blew my mind. And he showed me more examples and more examples of this. And so I had to accept it. And the one phrase I took away from that, and what I take away when I think about all of esports, is this generation has a different relationship with digital goods than my generation does, period. And if you refuse to accept that, you won't get anything in esports, absolutely none whatsoever. It's the same reason why I value a storage facility, and my nephew will look at me and say, well, why do you have everything you have to go and get it? You pay $200 a month and I have everything on the cloud that I need. Right? It's just a completely different relationship with the digital good, and the economy reflects that. And so just file that away and understand it, and absolutely do not question it. It's accept it as if you know it's 9.2 meters per second to go for gravity to go in the ground. Like it's a fact.
I think it's a great point because it ties into this generation's relationship to media properties and where revenue is actually going to come from when we're talking about media streams. You know, cord cutting, where you don't, how many of you don't pay for cable television? I'm one of those as well, right? So you start talking about cord cutting, you start talking about ad blocking, you start talking about free content, the mediatization of esports. This is also a very precarious economic space. So how is all this going to be monetized? What are people willing to pay for? There's, again, lots of experiments right now about that. But to me, it's a pretty open question, and it ties to things Netflix and Hulu and ABC and ESPN are all struggling with as well.
Yeah, and we struggle with it, and teams are struggling with it as well, as you try to think about how you go about making money in esports. Because right now it's lots of growth. If you talk to a lot of people, leagues included, the question is, how do you go about turning the profit? And some have been more successful than others, and a lot of it comes down to organizational structure. And so, Jake, can you talk a little bit about, at least from a team perspective, how the organizational structure works, you know, who the major players are for a team, and how you go about thinking about putting together or getting into new teams, because that's an economic investment.
Yeah. So getting into selecting which game we should get into and why. I mean, there's so many video games coming out constantly. That's one question I think you asked, and then another is how we structure the organization. So I'll start with the games. I think I look at a few things. The biggest one is, how easy is it to understand? When you think about fighting games with very conspicuous health bars, and if one's depleted, anyone can watch a fighting game and understand it, right? Street Fighter, those games, a sports game, Madden, FIFA, they understand those. It gets a little bit, Battle Royale is a great example. A lot of people watched Hunger Games, where, you know, 100 people drop into a map and the last one standing wins. That's very intuitive. Games like League of Legends and Overwatch, I think, are more challenging to get into and invest into, because you almost need a translator to make out the visual clutter in some of these games to the untrained eye. So I think the developers and the esports publishers who are hosting these tournaments, I think they have a lot of responsibility for these games to make sure that the casters and the hosts are educated in how to communicate in layman's terms what's happening on the screen. The analytics need to be robust and create that depth, which is very key, I think, too. There are games like Super Smash Bros. Melee, a beautiful game. It's been out for 17 years. It came out on the GameCube, and people are still playing Super Smash Bros. Melee. Thousands of people compete at these tournaments all around the United States and world, just because of how deep it is, right? So I look at those things. I look at how the structure of the league too. Each game and genre, like Khalid said, it's not a monolith. Every game and software company structures their league differently. League of Legends has 2 10-week seasons, a spring split and a summer split, with 2 playoffs after that, and a world championship, which just happened last weekend for this year in Korea. So that is a very different model than the same genre of League of Legends called Defense of the Ancients. Dota is what they call it. They don't have a league or circuit. It's one big $20 million prize pool tournament every year. So then when we're thinking about whether we should get into these games, Dota is very high risk, high reward. It's almost like for 10 months there's no value in being in Dota. You should just sign a team right before the big event. And then there's a lot of challenges and questions. How do you get into the Battle Royale space, the Fortnites, the player-unknown battlegrounds, before these league structures are starting to become tangible and fleshed out? And also, the competitive integrity in those games is really interesting, with so many variables of 100 talented players dropping into a map versus, you know, and looking at what the placements look like. The top 10 should change most tournaments. You're not going to see the same consistent performers, as opposed to a fighting game or a 5 versus 5 game or a 3 versus 3 game like Rocket League, where you could start seeing that continuity and competitive integrity. So it depends on the game. I think that's a big. There's so many moving parts as to why we should get into a game or why not.
So, TL, Jake just got finished talking about all different genres of games, MOBAs and first-person shooter, fighting games, battle royale. As we talk about esports in the Olympics, which is a very hot topic, just tea leaf it. Like, how do you see esports entering into the Olympics? Which games, which genres, all of them? How do you forecast that working?
Yeah, so I've now been to 2 events sponsored by the IOC where they are getting in conversation with esports. And the first, your own... Rick Fox moderated the first one in Switzerland. And what's really interesting about that issue is, again, it in many ways circles back to the media conversation. The Olympics is worried about losing young viewers. In fact, most sports are. Sports are worried about loss in viewership. And so they look at what's happening in esports and go like, is this how we get young viewers? And in fact, the second event I was at was the Youth Olympics, and they had a conversation about esports. What's fascinating to me is esports is like, do we need you? We're not so sure we need you. And again, I think part of this is a media conversation. When I was studying esports in the early 2000s, the idea of getting onto television eventually was a goal. And live streaming has disrupted that path. Now, many esports people I talk to say, we don't need television. We're on live streaming, we're at computers. And so the calculations about who needs who, I think, have shifted, the power shifted. The Olympics also continues to have, I think, really bad, faulty thinking about what athleticism looks like in relation to esports. So often when you're in conversation with folks from the Olympics, they sort of immediately think of the swimmers or the snowboarders, and that's athleticism. And actually the Olympics also has things like shooting. And so we might also think about the physicality involved in computer games, and it's real, and there is a physicality to it. The Olympics also has real issues around what they see as violence and violent content in games. And again, it was fantastic because at the first IOC meeting, Jake, a well-known young guy, plays Overwatch, he asked the head of the IOC a really nicely framed question about, well, actually, there's a lot of sports in the Olympics that are violent and have roots in actual, we can take boxing is still in the Olympics and is a very violent sport and produces a lot of injury. So this conversation around violence is often misunderstood, and it's misunderstood how violence works in games. Long term, I don't know what's going to happen long term, but there's some pretty big bridges that would have to be crossed for this to be solved.
You have druthers. If you could construct it yourself, how would you construct esports entering into the Olympic space, if at all?
I'm really ambivalent. There are things I think that we can leverage from the Olympics to some degree that are useful. So they actually do have a language around player rights and responsibilities. And that's something I think esports could leverage. They have some stuff around gender that's useful. Again, though, we also know they do really horrible stuff around gender, and they also do really horrible stuff around kind of how much, those of us who followed the Brazil Olympics and what the swimmers had to swim in, like, there are other moments where I'm going, like, I don't know if they're taking care of players so much. So there's stuff we could leverage in. But I think until they have a richer understanding of what competitive gaming is, it's just going to be sort of talking at cross purposes.
Kevin, I was going to ask, go ahead, but I was going to ask you from your view, the Olympics that's amateurism, right? You're a college esports guy, so I'm sure you have some views on this that are very particular.
I think we have to look at the model that the Overwatch World Cup has, because you're going to need the cooperation of publishers. So if everybody comes with their marquee game, it kind of controls their segment, and you still have the same methodology of country versus country, I think then, to TL's point, is there really a need to go through the IOC? You know, this is something that could be created with the cooperative of publishers with the top 10 games, and you wouldn't have all those issues related to, you know, legacy kind of concepts about gratuitous violence and so on.
Don't forget too that the issue of amateurism and professionalism is at this point fairly debunked in Olympic athletics. I mean, those athletes are professional. They are hustling. They are literally professional sometimes. So even that is shaky.
Sure.
That division is shaky ground all around, right?
Ever since Dan and Dave, right?
Yeah, I mean, so.
Yeah. So I do want to leave some really ample time for questions, but what I would like to do before we do that is if each of you go down, and I'll start with Jake and go down the line, if there's anything that we hadn't talked about but you think is a pressing, your number one issue with respect to esports that we haven't talked about or that you'd like to elaborate on further. Jake.
Well, I wanna provide a different take to the diversity. I think it's important to look at how there's a lot of success. I think that the gender challenges, and there's definitely disparity between men and women that play or compete at a high level. I think that there's a lot to celebrate currently. Right now, the number one ranked Smash 4 player in the world is a 17-year-old kid from Mexico, you know, and he won in the same tournament as Tokido, who's in his 30s from Japan, and he took a Street Fighter, who's in the same tournament as Sonic Fox, who's a gay black furry, and he just won Dragon Ball Fighter Z and Soul Calibur 2 weeks ago. The tournament, the World Championship of League of Legends this past weekend was won by a Chinese team. Korea took Overwatch. I think that globally, there's this accessibility issue, which you talked about, where the reason why I think Asia is competing at such a high level is because of how ubiquitous the internet cafes are over there. It's very hard to get PCs over here in the West. You have to basically buy, there's no internet cafes here, there's very few. So you do see diversity issues across consoles and platforms, but there are solutions that are out there. I think Fortnite is doing a great job in becoming very accessible on every console. You can play it on the Nintendo Switch, on your phone, on a computer, on an Xbox, on a PlayStation. So pretty much anyone who has any kind of gaming platform or device can compete in Fortnite, and I think that's really cool, and it's bridging the gap in a way that we've never seen before. So I think that there is an upside, and as technology keeps developing and getting more affordable and more accessible, you're going to start seeing this trickle down to diversity.
I actually had a question I wanted to ask Giovanna and Tio before we continue to go down the line. And this is this idea that esports has sort of expanded the pie and outside. I think about issues in esports and how they go to issues outside of esports into life and culture in general. And so the question is, do you think the rise in live streaming and the accessibility of mobile, specifically through esports, will have a tendency to lessen the digital divide in general?
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
So I think it depends on how attuned esports organizations are to the possibilities of esports existing outside of the narrow PC frame. So when I go to China, when I go to India, you know, those are places too where mobile dominates. And that requires folks to shift their thinking, because historically esports, and I love that you gave a shout out to the fighting game community, because the fighting game community is one of the most diverse, challenging, interesting spaces, but historically, they've also been an outlier, unfortunately. A lot of esports gets constructed around PC gaming, and I think it's really going to depend on how much organizations start realizing that North America and Europe kind of construct esports in one way, and it's going to look different in other places because the context, the infrastructures, the economic models, the technology are different. And so to me, it's a little bit how much imagination North American and European teams and platforms may have. I almost would ask it back to you all if you think the teams and the infrastructures we have now are paying attention to those spaces.
Well, certainly we are. So that was, Jake, you brought that up in my mind, so I wanted to ask you, but Jelena, please.
Yeah, well, I agree. I think it's like an accessibility issue. You know, if we go towards mobile, the more it would be. I agree with TL that we would be able to probably have a more consistent usage of gaming and introduce more people that are interested in esports. So mobile source is the way.
Any parting thoughts before questions as well?
Well, one issue I was just thinking, and I touched a bit on this with the skins, but a lot of it is like player and fan base created skins and IP, and it's interesting to think about ownership and from that perspective, and do the games own it when it's created in an in-game environment? Who owns that IP? And that is a big part of interest, I think, in terms of even in the esports arena, is getting feedback from fans. Like even the fans name some of the players. Like on one of your teams for H1Z1, they named like the pineapple. Yeah, and like there's a lot of input from the fan base and from the community that actually. In the esports tournament, they're giving, away electronic objects to different players, from the audience sometimes and things like that. So the interaction, the input, it's an important component. And I also think that the ownership of that IP is an interesting question going forward.
Going off of that, I think what you can find when you source these new emergent genres like Battle Royale or MOBA for League of Legends and Dota is that they started out as mods in another game, right? So these developers gave the community the tools to kind of create and edit the base game to do something creative, to capture the flag in a football game or do something really weird. So, League of Legends has roots as a StarCraft mod. Fortnite and PUBG started as a Arma 3 mod. So it's really interesting. And what you find is that those mods become so successful that the creators of those mods leave and create their own IP. League of Legends was one of the two splits. So it started as StarCraft, and then they went into Defense of the Ancients and it started as Dota, then it went to Dota 2 and League of Legends, but it all started as the same roots. So who owns, that mod if you create it and monetize it? I think it's really interesting.
That's great, because this is what I was going to say. Is I really think this is going to be one of the most important legal, cultural, critical conversations we face around esports. And part of it is a straight intellectual property conversation. Esports has historically only grown because of third-party user-based practices. Developers used to not care about esports until they figured out how they could start monetizing it. And so you don't get esports without all of that creative energy from people who may not technically own the IP, but are building infrastructures and organizations to make play possible. Now, I think in its most ambitious sense, we can think, the UN Statement on Human Rights says that humans have a right to sport. That's a really interesting provocation, I think, in this commercial moment where we talk about, can game companies kind of own the ball and say, like, you're done? I actually am really interested, and part of the work I do in my research is tracing out the ways people are doing powerful, transformative work with these intellectual properties, and that we need better models. We need co-creative models that think about IP as something that's constructed between a developer and organizations and people and practices. So to me, this is actually one of the most important issues in esports right now.
And for me, it's kind of building off of what you're saying. And for me, it's really about player development in two lenses. One is thinking about it from the physical, mental, and virtual. These athletes, I think there's an important lesson to learn from traditional sports. When you see players that have their careers ended after 4 to 5 years, really with no kind of future in mind. And I'm hoping that esports learns from that. It's been quoted that 60% of League of Legends players at college are STEM-related students. Dragon can attest to that. He's a BU gaming guy in the audience. And I just hope that as we start to build and the industry becomes professionalized, that there is an emphasis on career development, we know that by the time you hit 23 to 24, carpal tunnel is going to set in. Your reflexes aren't going to be as active as they are when you're 16. And trying to determine through esports entrepreneurship classes how to create better monetization models, how to do things like the MIT Enterprise Forum in terms of looking at startup ecosystem, how to apply the business model canvas to esports, and trying to identify new ways in new areas of growth and interest. So I'm hoping that we learn as we build this whole model for collegiate esports, and hoping that we can incorporate better curriculum and learning practices, more public-private partnerships to help support those players so that they're not just left hanging once they graduate trying to determine a career path, that it's something that we can predetermine even at the scholastic level. There's high school esports companies now getting VC dollars. There's $15 million that went into a company called Play Versus. So you're gonna start seeing Little League, high school, the emergence of scholastic esports. So it's important to have that balance, to understand that physical well-being is equally as important as gameplay. So whether it's exercises for part of the time, then there's mental well-being. The Jacksonville shooting is a pure testament to how mental issues related to esports is an area that we need to deal with, but also just looking at the long tail and understanding that players need to have the ability to get the support as opposed to them just being on the bright lights in the stage to kind of make money for the big teams. No pun intended, gentlemen, but to really think about the long tail in terms of player development as a whole.
Fantastic. And with that, we'll open up the floor and the stream to questions. So if anyone has questions, I see it. Yep, there's a question.
Hey, I'm Corey.
Hi, Gordon.
I'm curious if you have any thoughts on how platforms and policy can better deal with the problem of swatting and doxing in esports.
Yes.
Can you repeat that one more time?
Yeah, sure. Am I close enough?
Maybe explain swatting and doxing for the folks who don't know.
Yes.
Yeah, so swatting has become more common since 2013. It's the practice of calling the police on someone that you might have a feud with, maybe another player, and falsely reporting that there's like a hostage scenario or a bomb threat, right? So the police have to go investigate, and they will often bring a SWAT team, knock down the door, and someone who's on a live stream could potentially be shot, and in fact, people have died from swatting. So I'm really curious, and also, doxing is the publishing of someone else's private details, like their home address, credit card numbers, whatever. So I think there's a real opportunity for platforms to provide better tools, maybe they're breadcrumbs for law enforcement, or some kind of insurance vehicle to help victims. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
My initial thoughts are, I think that doxing has been around. I feel like doxing is a byproduct of internet and how connected people are with the internet, and how people seem to be way less cautious with putting personal information on their social media platforms. There's all these weird things with all these apps tracking your location and getting your IP addresses, whether it's through a game or through an app or through Facebook. I feel like that's a danger of the internet, and I would hope. I've seen SWAT cases where the kids that did make those calls, they're still serving in prison, and I hope it is taken that seriously, because like you said, there are tragedies surrounding that. It's a very real thing and real crime to call a SWAT team on someone and fake a hostage, fake terrorism, right? So I think it falls on the judicial system a little bit, and also how there's this narrative, especially with the Facebook stuff happening, right? How people are becoming more skeptical again with how they're engaging the internet with their own information and developing more tools to protect the user.
Yeah, I was going to say, so this is such a real problem that, for people who are making a living streaming, they will often now contact their local police departments ahead of time and try to explain to them, I'm a streamer, here's what I do, this is happening. For me, I would almost kind of pop the question out into a much bigger conversation about platform responsibility in general. And swatting and doxing doesn't happen in a vacuum, it happens on platforms that continue to facilitate and sustain really awful behavior. And part of it is, and we know, right, we know this from, it's not just esports, it's not just gaming, it's how Twitter handles things like harassment, toxicity, the rise of the alt-right. So I think in general, platforms have to start taking a lot more responsibility for the kinds of cultures that they, by their inaction, foster. And I see doxing and swatting as part of this bigger phenomenon.
Thanks.
Anyone else? Yeah, please.
Hi, my name is Jordan, and I guess I have a question about esports organization and brand loyalty. I guess my background is League of Legends and Overwatch, and for me, as a viewer, I see brand loyalty being tied up with the players that you have on the team, and I was wondering how an organization can address that. So, for example, when CLG lost Doublelift and Afromu, I feel like their brand really suffered as a team. So I guess for the longevity of a brand, how do you plan to address that?
So I'll talk about it from the standpoint of an owner. Jake may have a different view in the trenches. It's actually, you're raising a question as an esports fan that has been a question of sports ownership for ages, ever since sports existed. You take any given team with any given stars, and you look at the NBA. The NBA has chosen to build through the actual stars. They market LeBron James and Steph Curry and Giannis Antetokounmpo. They market the players, and so you become a fan of that player. And when they move, you sort of move with them. I mean, you still support your team. And so esports has a lot of player movement, especially in League of Legends. And so it happens a lot. So what you try to do is you try to create an infrastructure of fandom so that you're not so reliant on any one player. And so if your culture is, you know, we're the team that wins, and you try to do that consistently to retain those fans. But I don't think that you ever will get out of sports this idea of people wanting to be fans of individual players. There's one sports league that's done this better than any others, and that's the NFL, where they market the shield and they market the teams and the regions more so than players. There are the Tom Brady's and the Aaron Rodgers who are the faces, but everyone else goes behind a helmet and a mask, and so they've done a really good job. But as well, I don't think I want to get out of that. I think we want there to be stars, and we want there to be intrigue of movement, and we want you to, you know, to feel like you're connected to that player. But at the same time, we want to create cultures where players are fans of our teams. Esports has a little bit different issue as well. So you're a League of Legends player, and so you're fan, and so you're talking about movements between teams in league. But I've got a bigger problem. I've got to get you as a League of Legends fan to be a fan of Taquito. So you might be a Hoonie fan, so it means you're only following Echo Fox. Well, how do I get you to follow MKLeo? How do I get you to follow Taquito? How do I get you to follow my Counter-Strike guys? That's really the challenge, more so than what do I do with my stars, leave my League of Legends team, because every sports team deals with that over every sport.
I will say too, I think the structure of the game and genre is a big part of it too. League just franchised in 2018, Overwatch franchised as well. They're the first games that did franchise, and I think a lot of those trades you were talking about happened right before the franchising happened, and a lot of contract rights and parameters are still developing in real time. We can now sign players for 3 years, and what does that look like? Riot also kind of dictates the trading and transferring, and there's now free agency windows. You know, the League of Legends one's on November 19th, so there should be a lot of trades and movement happening then. But I think it does make it more interesting now with franchise teams, because back when teams would come and go through relegations, back in the day, the worst performing teams could lose their franchise slot to the minor league best performing teams. They're fighting for their spot. So you're seeing teams, the integrity of being an esports team is strengthened, I think, with franchising, and then also signing these longer term deals makes more sense with stability from the team side. And that also trickles down to the trades and movement, I think. So like Khalid said, it's very interesting. I think Double Lift's a great example of a player that has succeeded in a bunch of different North American teams, just like, LeBron and some of those other guys.
And to go one step deeper on your answer, reason why I don't mind it so much at the macro, at the mini level, right, at the micro level, we have a star league, our performance could suffer. But if you think about what other sports leagues have done, NFL in particular, NBA is getting there, is they've made their out of season almost as intriguing as their in season, right? Where players are going, who's getting drafted, who's getting traded. They've made all of that almost as interesting from a content standpoint as what's happening in season. And so if we can replicate that in esports, where there's interest even when a game's not happening, well, that's the jackpot. And if there's too much staticness in the movement of players, then you really don't get that.
I would just add, I think hovering in your question too is the issue of regionality. That, regionality still is a really important part of traditional sports fandom, even though you can find fans of traditional sports teams all around the world. And I think esports is still trying to figure this out. And, Overwatch's franchising model, where they've appended, I would say, fairly meaningless regionality to their. So there's a Boston Overwatch team. They don't play here. They rarely. I think they're gonna be here soon for something you're doing, but
December 8th.
But they are rarely here. But
That's how you really feel today.
It's an interesting attempt to try to start. They're trying to think through that model, and it's whether or not it works is another issue.
What's really cool in China is that all these League of Legends teams in China have the money and infrastructure to actually start building their own stadiums. So these Chinese LPL teams, which is the Chinese equivalent of the North American League of Legends series, once they start building out their stadiums and actually have that type of infrastructure, you might start seeing very interesting and meaningful regionality competitions.
Yeah, and on that, I'm actually if I had the power, would oppose regionalization in esports, but only because you see traditional sports trying to be global. NBA and NFL, they play games in Europe, in Mexico, and go into India and proselytize in China and send players there because they want to be global. Well, I'm already there. I'm where the traditional sports want to be. So why would I make myself local and regional again? I feel like I'd be hindering myself. Right now, as Echo Fox, I can have fans in Mexico City, and Pyeongchang, and Guangdong. I can have fans all around the world. So why would I tell all those fans, no, only the people in Chicago matter? That doesn't make sense for me to getting in a global sport and then make myself local.
This is for Jack and Khalid. So when you guys are looking at new games to get into, what are you doing to protect against, like, for example, it took League years to build out, an audience and a fan base and become an esport, but Fortnite came around within a couple of months and became just as big and just as competitive with massive prize pools. So what are you doing when you look at the future of esports? And obviously you guys are building a brand and it's more focused around the media and everything. When you go to invest into a new esport or when a new game comes up, what are you looking at and what are the kind of provisions you're putting aside?
I think today is a very great example. So PUBG, PlayerUnknown Battlegrounds, just announced today that what their 2019 circuit looks like. They've committed, I think it was over $10 million or $20 million for the World Championships next year. They're doing a global, kind of like League of Legends. China has their own circuit, Korea, United States, and then the top performers of each region compete in the World Championship. So I think it didn't make sense to get into PUBG before today's announcement because PUBG's been out for a year and a half. What was the value? And there were a couple of early adopters in PUBG. Oh, wow, it's an emerging game. Let's get our hands in it right away and spend a lot of money. Well, what's the return on that? We have to view, esports as a business as well. Dota is another great example. We've talked about that model a little bit, how it's one tournament kind of. Counter-Strike is similar. It's very tournament-based and not a circuit-based. So you have to ride that fine line of, should we take a bet and invest in a game like Fortnite before they've announced their structure entirely, or do we wait until some more unfolds? Fortnite specifically, back in July, Epic Games announced that they're not selling franchise slots. So Fortnite has a weird philosophy. It's a very unique philosophy where hey, we want everybody to play the game on every console, all around the world, and there's no restrictions. Anybody can go compete and win the $5 million pot. They've committed $100 million next year, and none of it's going to specifically franchise slots or stuff like that. So as an esports org, that's a challenge and a question that's still unanswered. How do we engage Fortnite from a esports perspective if the publisher is very outspoken about how they're not going by traditional franchising model? We're still working it out.
And like single player games like that. So you still have TSM picking up, TSM Break and stuff, and people who are going to, or Myth, who are going to compete in Fortnite tournaments, stuff like that, but they're part of a team. So.
Yeah, so Fortnite is probably going to kind of announce what their structure is like. They've just implemented in-game tournaments, and I suspect that they're going to be using the results from those online tournaments to pool maybe a combine or maybe some kind of draft where players that are sponsored like Myth, if they're top performers, they're going to win those online tournaments and they're going to be invited to the combine under a team brand. So we could place bets on those players. So a single player game is very different too. I think it's a lot safer to get into when you're looking at a team game. There's a huge bottom line on what does it mean to operate a team esport. League of Legends, you need a team house. We have scouts, analysts, coaches. We have a chef, right? How are we going to feed these guys? We have insurance for these guys because they're not very well balanced. And it's up to the team, I think, to make sure that they're given all the life skills and tools they need to just succeed and perform. It's kind of an arms race there. A single player game is much easier to get into and much safer because you don't have to move them in, right? They're not competing with, you're not worrying too much about culture and the emphasis of team dynamics because they're competing on themselves. Of course, we support them. So, yeah, we're looking at a lot of things. The cost is one of them, how they structure their league, and more moving parts.
So I have questions. I've been wondering for a couple of years now, actually, and you alluded to it earlier. So with esports, I think more so than any other time, you have a person's likeness tied to bits and numbers and statistics and data. So, previously case law has sort of said that statistics don't count as likeness. With esports, I see that changing, and I'm wondering if you do too, and if so, how?
Yeah. I was going to defer to the lawyer.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's a fantastic question.
Yeah, it is a great question.
I am an attorney and also I think about it from both ends and really conflicting on both sides because as a team owner, yeah, I mean, I'd like to think that that's mine. It's part of what I'm paying for, as a matter of fact. And if it were otherwise, then perhaps I'd pay a different number or a lesser number.
Well, I was going to say, and part of what I'm curious about is how do you see what defines likeness changing? Because I don't see a lawsuit between Faker and Riot or whomever. I see a lawsuit between TSM and it's going to be a team and a publisher that's going to have the lawsuit, and they're going to feel this is likeness or this isn't likeness.
Yeah, so at the risk of giving you a non-answer, I don't, which I will go on to give you a non-answer. No, but I don't see that so much as a risk. A team versus the publisher, I don't see as a risk. And the only reason why is because those agreements between teams and publishers are so well defined. If you've seen one, it's quite voluminous, and some things I think should be taken out. But some of those rights are clear. What I do see though is that becoming between a player and an organization. Those things are much more blurred, and especially as controls loosen from the team side, the org side, to the players, there's going to be a fight for that. We mentioned players associations, and players associations will be very important in defining the issues that you're talking about. right now. But while you ask that question, I think it's important because there's 3 constituencies involved in esports, but only 2 in traditional sports. In traditional sports, it's ownership, which is the league that negotiates with the Players Association, which is the players. But in esports, the publisher owns the league, and then the team owners have to negotiate with them, and we have to negotiate with players. And so I like to call it the negotiation sandwich, in which we're the pastrami right now, and I don't like that position, right? Because you get bitten. And so we're trying to create structures more where teams have more of a say-so and more of an ownership stake in the structures themselves, which I say all of that to say is that some of the structural aspects of the way esports currently exist argue towards that question being answered sort of later in the line. But secondarily, I think that it will be the players who sort of look to define what that is vis-a-vis the teams. And I don't really foresee it being a team versus publisher issue.
Hey, so what advice would you give to someone like myself who is deeply interested in this whole landscape and in culture in general, but I sort of like don't know where to get started, like where to learn more about things? Like, is there an ESPN of esports, or do I just like go on Twitch for half an hour every day to like learn a little bit more, knowing like how limited like amounts of time we all have, just to kind of get more of a grasp on this whole landscape?
Are you a college student?
I've graduated now, but I'm working full time now. So I graduated recently, but I'm working full time right now.
I mean, I would recommend once you identify the area of entrance, really just studying that industry. For example, my curriculum at Emerson College, there really wasn't any textbooks, so I had to use publicly available information, white papers, articles, Q&As to assemble this curriculum. So there's a lot of information available online. TL publishes research and information. There's a ton, like academia.com has a lot of extensive research done by high-level MBAs all over the world on particular topics, and really just understand who are the players in that space. Really use LinkedIn. It's a great tool to identify who are the players in that space, be it the companies or the executives that are really making moves, and looking at each company and looking at their quarterly reports. If they're a publicly available company, looking at any information that they release, PR releases. If there's any live events, go to the events and try to network. I would it really depends on what area you want to really get into. The player space is pretty difficult just to become a ninja or someone, off the bat. But in terms of the other types of areas, afterwards, I would love to talk to you about it because I could probably help to guide you in the right direction.
Awesome.
If that helps.
Yep, definitely.
This forum is the place you go to figure out your next step. You've taken the first step. That's right.
I actually left work early, but don't tell anybody that.
I will say too, there's so much opportunity in gaming right now in general, not just esports.
Yes.
I think you have to view it like someone that likes film, right? There's so many jobs associated with making a movie. There's stage setting, there's acting, there's directing, producing. A lot of people think it's just acting and directing, right? But there's screenwriting. There's so much you could do, just like with gaming. You can work on the player side, which is there's so much opportunity on the team side. There's a huge need for sports psychologists, for example, that specialize in culture and team dynamics, that understand gaming as a foundation. Because we can find and try and identify non-endemic sports psychologists, but they have no clue what gaming is and the culture is. Everything from injury and lifestyle. I think what's really cool and concerning is each game has their own injury associated with it. Super Smash controller games like Super Smash Brothers, they get this ball removed. There's a lot of players like hacks, and top performing players get finger surgery and wrist surgery. League of Legends players and MOBA players, they play high sensitivity, so they play anchored wrist, and then they move their wrist like this, so they get carpal tunnel in the wrist. First-person shooter players, they play big mouse pad, anchored elbow, so that you can be accurate at very, very, very precise distances. So they get tennis elbow. And no one really is teaching this stuff. And from a professional level, we really hope that the research and the collegiate space is a big catalyst to help kind of develop the pro space with respect to things like rest and how do you approach that. So there are not enough people in gaming right now that can affect esports from the coaching level. There's opportunities at conventions. There are so many gaming conventions, PAX, E3, DreamHack. You can go to these lands where there's a ton of different booths set up and publishers that are aching for people who are taking initiative just to be approached to demonstrate passion about the industry. There's so much opportunity. Like you said, like Khalid said, coming out here is the first step, and then just really trying to put yourself out there and tap into the local collegiate events too, even if you're not in school. The student organizations right now are becoming massive. From 5 years ago, I was just in Colorado and I met the president of the Boulder University there. They had an event, 750 kids showed up, which is insane. And that's only their second year doing it. So even if you're not attending that university, they are very inclusive and welcoming of anyone who's interested in trying to grow it.
Awesome.
And I must add, I came from the music industry. I was an executive producer and manager. I got 4 Grammy-nominated clients, and I didn't know much about esports. And the first thing I did was looked up, a database and looked around the Boston area, and I found TL. And I came to her office, and I had all these ideas, and I just said, "Hey, what about esports?" And she's like, "Hey, slow down. This is what you got to do." She pointed me in the right direction, and at that point, I started to build my network. And then, through teaching, I learned from students, international students, that tell me about the culture in Korea and Asia and like all the other territories. So it's out there. You just have to find, your niche, and maybe looking at some skills that you have. If you're a web designer, there's always a need for web designers. If you're a photographer, if you create content, there's a huge need for narrative, storytelling. That's such a huge component to esports, and there's not enough out there. So really looking at what you do well and applying it to esports really works too.
And from a technology perspective, like if I don't know what your area of expertise is, but if you have, a technology background, looking at a lot of the problems we discussed today and trying to find a technological solution for that, and then sort of building a company around that, trying to develop a business plan, and fleshing it out in like a white paper and that kind of thing. You can really, if you have a technical solution to a problem that has some legs, then that might be something that you could get into.
Or you can even write a book called Watch Me Play and release it. Shameless plug. TL's got an amazing book, Christmas List. TL's book on Twitch is a must-have.
It's not, you don't even need to buy it on Amazon if you want.
On Amazon, I'm sorry.
It is, yeah. There's a free Creative Commons version too. WatchMePlay.cc. Thank you. That's my best.
Fantastic question too.
That was a great question and a great story. My name's Taylor McBride, and first of all, thank you to you guys for all coming and participating. It was really cool, and I sincerely regret that I didn't wear my Sub-Zero Halloween costume here tonight.
That's a cool shirt you got, though, I have to say.
My question is for the, 2 gentlemen from Echo Fox. It's not related to the business implications, really, of e-gaming, but instead the actual, gameplay and about analytics. In another lifetime, I played No Limit Texas Hold'em tournaments online for a living, and there was a big difference between playing intuitively and playing with heads-up software that monitors everything that's happening, and then you can print out a report about your weakest hands and all that kind of stuff like that. And I know that obviously with you guys have a big NBA, your roots with Rick Fox and everything, and James Harden is the MVP of the NBA, and you would not have James Harden. Houston leads the embracing analytics and tendencies and flow charts of activities on the court. So I would just be really curious, if you guys knew or could talk at all about the use of analytics to take a good player to the optimal, because I know you guys are all about optimizing the person that is the player, and so I would just really want to know how do you, is there software like that, just anything about analytics in game?
Yeah, so we have analyst teams, we have scouts, which really get to the granular level of how do you evaluate a player, right? Especially with respect to other regions globally. It's kind of an arms race right now. So what's really cool about gaming is there are a lot of native tools that the publisher sometimes gives out to, League of Legends, for example, has an online ranking system. Fortnite does not. So there are third-party websites where I can go look up right now in the United States, in California, in Los Angeles, who is the top performing PC player based on win, loss, record, and stuff like that. So I can identify people right now, but the layer deeper than that, those are trade secrets. I mean, we have databases filled with risk assessment. How do you quantify a high risk player? You know, what is their background? Who are they engaged with? Who are they friends with? What are their priorities as a player? How are they as a teammate? That's stuff you can't look up. So especially with recruiting international talent, getting that sweet stuff is an arms race. And I like the way our analyst team approaches that stuff.
Yeah, and we're always trying new things too. As the technology develops, it makes it a little bit easier. But you know, early on in the days, we did everything from individual word analysis to what our players were saying to each other, and mapping that to certain parts of the game where we did well. And I mean, we went to a very granular level, as you would imagine, any team sport that looks at the dynamics between teams. And on that point, it is a team sport. You know, baseball sort of a team sport masquerading as an individual, or an individual sport masquerading as a team sport. You could kind of just look at statistics and throw your lineup out there. League and other team sports aren't really like that. So you could statistically have a great team, and if the chemistry is not there, or the coordination, or the communication, or even down to the way they talk to us a lot, that, you know, the way guys interact out of the game translates to how they interact in the game. And so that's very important. So you can have all the statistical analysis, but sometimes the soft information is just as important too.
And going off of that too, the technology is still developing. There's a really cool piece of technology out right now. You can buy it for about $150, and it's called the Tobii eye tracking. And I think it's going to start bridging the gap between the physicality and mechanical human element with the in-game statistics, because that's what everybody's looking at right now. You know, how fast can they click and move around? But you can start tracking exactly where their eyes are moving. How many times Faker, for example, as a mid laner, looks at the mini-map, or looks at his teammates, or looks at his health. And you can compare that with a rookie or another North American player, and then you can start creating trends on, okay, what is the physicality? Wow, this rookie has the same, he looks at the map so much, and he does all these things that are similar to a double lift or a Faker. You can start scouting more efficiently, starting to run those lines. And it's also on the developers too. League has been out for a long time, and they only just released a sandbox mode where you can start drilling and do drills, and you can start doing unique things where it's not just playing a 40-minute game for 6 hours a day against other teams. You can start actually creating exercises, and all the analytics you create on those drills that the team has to create, they're not out there, adds a whole other layer of analytics to evaluating players.
Thank you, guys.
So from a commercial standpoint, how does the money emanating from licensing rights into players' stream content flow from the broadcasting or streaming platform back to the players or their respective teams? How does that flow go?
You mean the splits, kind of like the revenue streams on Twitch if they're streaming?
Yeah, or a feature at an event or anything like that.
I think that's case by case basis, depending on the team and also the player. That's part of the negotiations, right? It's if I sell a team jersey, if I'm a player and I sell a team jersey with my name on it, should I get a bigger cut than if I sell a standard jersey? Or how much of my growth on these streaming platforms is actually because my team invested in me and built my brand and did these content pieces around. And creating that system where both feel like they're incentivized and both are winning is a key balance to find. Each team structures it a little bit differently and have very different business models on how they create that incentive. So it's definitely, there's no hard hard structure for it.
I would just add too, when we were talking earlier about ways people earn money on Twitch, we had mentioned donation systems, and ad revenue, and subscription models is another big part of it, right? So you can subscribe to a person's channel, and Twitch has standard rates that they give people cuts of, except in the cases of people who are, top target influencers. And those people are also then, those players may be negotiating with teams, and those teams may also in turn, and players be negotiating with Twitch to cut different deals around revenue that they're getting from the platform. So as with all of these spaces, if you're pulling in a lot of views, if you're seen as a high profile influencer, your revenue share from the platform may be different than the average broadcaster. So there's negotiation happening on sort of both sides of the pipeline, I guess we would say.
Yeah. And some teams prioritize prize money more than others versus salary. Some players say, hey, I want a low salary, but I want all my prize money. Some players say, I want consistency and stability. I want high salary. The team can take all of my prize money. So it also depends on the person and the player and what they value and whether it's their brand or their money, short-term money, stability, consistency, all those things are thought about.
And if they have a lawyer? Something more esports players.
Follow-up question real fast to that. Sorry about that. So what are some of the bottlenecks in terms of the broadcasting or streaming service paying the team, and then whereby the team has a split with the potential influential player who's streaming?
So not every revenue stream goes through the platform. For example, a merchandise store. That is a link on the platform. So the money isn't going to Twitch and then Twitch pays us and then we pay the player. Right. They buy the merch through us and then we pay the player whatever split we negotiated with. There are 3 revenue streams on Twitch. Ad revenue, bits, which is Twitch's take on donations, and then subscriptions. Those are the main 3 core revenue pieces. And those are the only revenue streams that go through Twitch. It is kind of an interesting experience, and some teams have been more successful than others, where it feels bad as a player if you get an invoice from your team that you have to pay your team X amount of dollars. And some players have really bad reactions about that. So, but some teams where they really have branding as part of their culture and their values and the players bought in, they're happy to write that check because it's a win-win on both sides. So a lot of it's team culture and brand. But you have to remember that those brand deals, those affiliate links, those merchandise deals, those are much more organic because it goes to the team and then the team pays the player. It feels better, I think.
Thank you.
This can be a quick one. Just curious how Facebook might be trying to muscle in on the space. They seem to be kind of left out right now, but if it's going to be so big, I would imagine they want a piece of the pie.
They're in it, but it's kind of, I don't want to say it's a failed effort, but it's lukewarm, we'll say.
Part of it is,
please elaborate.
Part of it's because their functionality is just not even close to what is expected on. So there's a couple live streaming platforms right now that are the front runners, Twitch being one of them, coming from a gaming space, a gaming streaming website, now trying to expand outward into more than just gaming, because before they were like, hey, we really want this to be gaming. And then YouTube Live has started adding a lot of functionality that Twitch has. And now they're trying to go from YouTube, which is everything, and becoming more attractive to gamers. Facebook hasn't really thought about those things yet. I don't think you can stream at 1080p yet. You can't stream at 60 FPS yet, I think, unless they just added that. The subscription model, the emotes, the culture of how the chat engages with the influencer is not there. And those are, I think, very key fundamental pieces as to why streaming is interesting to a fan. I do see potential in Facebook, though, because of how sharing is integrated, right? So if you're live streaming and all your friends are watching you stream and they all share to their friends and they all share, there's that exponential effect. But I don't think gamers are on Facebook very much. So there's a lot of points there, but they are pumping in a lot of money and trying to start buying exclusive contracts to these big influencers to try and buy their way in and stimulate credibility there. You're starting to see Mixer from Microsoft as a live streaming platform, Caffeine from some of the Apple people. They're all trying to create slightly different takes on the functionality to attract gamers to come on their platform.
I was just going to add one other just quick thing is the other thing that does happen around esports events is those will get broadcast out, whether through a third-party company that's like white labeling, producing it, or the developer themselves. Those broadcasts get picked up then in different countries and different regions and wrapped with regional, local stuff and often put on other platforms. So in fact, I mean, you know, here in North America, the US, we think about Twitch a lot, but if you go to China, there are live streaming platforms that blow Twitch's numbers out of the water. And so there is this whole broader global media ecosystem that's developing. Right now, I think we're almost in a little bit of a funny moment where Twitch dominates because it's there and it does have good functionality, but the global media space is going to be pretty interesting.
One really cool, I guess, thing that's happening in China is that the live streaming platforms are so big there that a lot of the top performing Chinese players stop competing professionally because they're making a multiplicative amount through streaming than they would ever get on an esports salary. So figuring out that balance is going to be really interesting, especially now that there are more eyeballs coming on these Western platforms, whereas gaming is leagues ahead in Asia culturally. It's always been this accepted and celebrated thing. We're only now just getting that in the West. So that'll make our jobs interesting.
Yeah, we got time for one more question. But before the question is asked, no. But before the question is asked, I will repeat that after we are done here, we're going upstairs to the 4th floor. Is that right? Correct. To the 4th floor, and not down here. We're going to go upstairs to the 4th floor afterwards, and we'll talk some more about esports. This is a lot. This is a lot of pressure. This is the last question.
Talk about skins gambling.
Yes.
Could we talk about good old-fashioned sportsbook gambling, especially with the Supreme Court ruling, and how esports and those things may converge, not converge?
There is no may converge. It's will converge and is converging. And as a matter of fact, I was at a conference in Vegas just recently where that was a front and center topic. And one of the speakers on a panel was an owner of a casino and the owner of a company that sets lines for traditional sports. And they're all trying to figure out esports. And so, that's obviously, we can do 2 hours on that particular topic, but I'll give my one takeaway from that. And we're all figuring it out, and MGM has sort of an in-house esports team that's dealing with this issue, and everyone's trying to sort of figure it out. But the one thing that the person who owns the company setting line said, and this made a lot of sense to me, everyone with the fervor over the Supreme Court ruling and believing that this is going to be growth for esports, and it will, and we sort of leave to the side that a lot of states are specifically excluding esports right now. I'm not even worried about that because time moves people forward, and so eventually that will go away as well. But the one thing that came out for me is that, I said, even if you turned on sports gambling for esports tomorrow, there is such a dearth of people who can set accurate lines. That the casinos will stay away because lines can't get set. And one of the big issues in esports, specifically in the dominant esports like League of Legends, is that the game actually changes during the middle of the season, right? Imagine the NBA moving the three-point line forward in the middle of the season. Well, you neutralize the effect of a Steph Curry or Klay Thompson or Malcolm Brogdon. You neutralize all the great three-point shooters. So the lines will be set completely differently because the way teams score would be different. Well, in League of Legends, that happens. How many times a year, Jake, do they change?
Once every 2 weeks.
Once every 2 weeks, the game literally changes. So it's difficult to have lines that are set. So a team that was dominant, you change the game, you change the way they have to play, and so another team may become dominant. And this happens often. And so there's going to have to be a lot of standardization across esports, but even within the esports before the esports space is really ripe for the kind of robust sports gambling that we see out of traditional sports.
And I have an interesting theory. I think as it relates to college esports betting, I think they should use the state lottery model because you can't stop it. So why not use it to fund esports programs, computer equipment, STEM, other types of related programs, because you can't really stop it, and why have it go to the Cayman Islands? Why not have it reinvest in our infrastructure? Right?
Everyone, thank you very, very, very much. And with that, we will go to the fourth floor, eat, drink, and be merry.
Is there wine machine?